Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Claire Noble, the Program Manager with the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. For 49 years, we've been providing thought-provoking, affordable programming to the Vail community. We put on about 45 programs a year, typically about one a week. And usually those are live in-person events, but for the foreseeable future, we will be doing webinars on Thursday evenings for the most part. Our home, Vail, Colorado, is one of North America's premier outdoor recreation destinations. Tonight's topic, the role of governors during the COVID-19 crisis, was settled upon about 2 weeks ago. And of course, in the intervening 2 weeks, we've had the momentous upheaval in our country in the wake of the tragic death of George Floyd. So we'll be addressing that this evening as well. Some program notes before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you should see an option for Q&A, and that's how you're going to communicate with our speakers this evening. Put your questions and comments there. I will monitor those questions and comments and share them throughout the program with our speakers. I do want to mention that we are a community organization of friends and neighbors. So I'll just ask that everyone keep their questions and comments kind and civil and not use the Q&A portion for promotion of businesses or products. This program runs until 7 o'clock this evening. It is being recorded, so if you'll just give us a day or so, we'll have it up on our website as well as our Facebook wall. I would also like to thank our sponsors for tonight's program, the Vail Daily, the Antlers at Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, and the Town of Vail. Tech support tonight is being provided by Joe Kania of Fully Committed Films. I'd also like to thank our underwriters for this evening's program. Underwriting the summer season are Cindy Ingalls and Leela and Walt Misher. Underwriting the Hot Topic series are Kathy and Neil Kimmel. And the Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. I also want to alert you to 2 programs that we have next week. Coming up on Tuesday evening, June 9th at 6 p.m., we have Quackery, the brief history of the worst ways to cure everything with Dr. Lydia Kong. Again, that's Tuesday at 6 p.m. And then we also have another program next Thursday. This is a collaboration with the Vail Valley Partnership. It's one of our morning programs, so that will start at 9 a.m. on Thursday. And that's a program on mindfulness and empathy at work with Amy Quinn. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by 2 former governors. Former Governor of Ohio, John Kasich, was the governor of Ohio from 2011 to 2019. He was in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1983 to 2001. And between that, he hosted Heartland with John Kasich on Fox News from 2001 until 2007. He's the author of 4 New York Times best-selling books, Courage is Contagious, Stand for Something, The Battle for America's Soul, Every Other Monday, and 2 Paths, America, Divided or United. His latest book is It's Up to Us, 10 Little Ways We Can Bring About Big Change. Former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson was governor of New Mexico from 2003 until 2011. Prior to that, he was Secretary of Energy. Prior to that, he was U.S. Ambassador to the UN. And prior to that, he was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, joining the same year as John Kasich, 1983. Tonight's moderator is Professor Parinandi. He's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He researches and teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on American political institutions and public policy, with special emphasis on state governmental policy regarding energy and the economy. Professor Parinandi, thank you also for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to you, and you can check in with me for audience questions and comments throughout the program.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you to the Vail Symposium for organizing this event and reaching out to me. And thank you as well to both of our distinguished governors for agreeing to spend their time to answer these questions and communicate with the broader community. I think we all very much appreciate your thoughts and wisdom at this moment in time. So in the interest of preserving—
If I could start, I cannot show face on here, which is fine with me. It ain't that great. But Claire, for some reason, it says that you have not allowed me to do this. Hey, there we go. Now it's working. Now it's working. Okay, good. Billy, how are you?
Johnny, good to be with you, pal.
You're the man. Thank you.
Well, thank you. In the interest of preserving as much time as possible for both of you and for audience questions, I'm just going to go straight into the first question. And obviously, if you have your own questions you'd like to ask each other, feel free to do so. The way that I envision this is sort of I ask a question and then you both can answer sort of in any order that you see fit. So I'll start with the very first question. So this pertains to COVID and to some of the metrics that governors and governments are using to define operational success in terms of mitigating COVID. And so to get the conversation started, how would you define success in mitigating COVID-19? And have the nation's governors, in your opinion, been successful at mitigating COVID?
Johnny, you want to go first?
Bill, you go ahead and start.
Okay. Well, look, governors are politicians. First, there are a lot of polls that come out, monthly favorability polls that we all listen to. Then we have private polls, and having a strong favorable rating on how you handle the COVID, I think every governor looks at it. I think governors have been the successful agents for dealing with COVID because you mentioned, Professor, or Claire did, all the jobs that I had and John had. The best job I ever had was a governor because you run the agenda, you run the show, and you have enormous power to deal with the problems at hand. So how do you define success with a COVID issue? One, the infection rate. This is something that in New Mexico, my governor has done well. Social distancing, is it acceptable? Stay-at-home orders, is it acceptable? I think John Kasich's governor, Mike DeWine, has done a good job. The governor of Maryland has done a good job, Larry Hogan. I think Governor Cuomo, despite having sometimes bad news, being on television every day reporting, Governor of California in the same vein. So that's how you define success. There's a political side, but I think there's also the substantive side of if you have situations where the COVID is reducing, where you have plenty of tests, where the public seems to accepting some very, very tough restraining orders. That's a definition of success. But I think what needs to be measured in the days ahead is the American people want their jobs back. The American people want a loosening of the restrictions. How do you balance those? I think is going to be key politically to how this COVID issue eventually plays out in a presidential election, which is 5 months away.
There's not a heck of a lot I can add to that. I think that what has happened is the governors have, many of them, I can't judge all of them because I don't follow all of them, but if you were to take my state, I think that Mike DeWine decided that it was better to be more careful than less careful. And he didn't want to roll the dice and say, let's just go ahead and open up. And so there was a thing that came out, a prescription that came out that, you can be red, you can then move to orange, you can move to yellow, and then to green, depending on what the risk was. And, so there's a slow reawakening in the country. Some places opening faster than others. If I were governor, there's a lot of things I would do or say about the way I would proceed, but you have to keep an eye on things. You got to watch the hot spots. To me, a lot of it is testing and masks and social distancing. And, somebody gave me these statistics. I think they're accurate. Okay, but let me try. Japan has 125 million people. I think they've had 800 deaths. You have Hong Kong, which has 7 million people, and they, believe it or not, have had 4 deaths. And over in Sweden, where they have 10 million, they've had about 4,300 deaths. And what it tells you is the culture of wearing a mask, washing your hands, social distancing, it really works. And so if you're a governor, I guess the only place where I would disagree with Billy, but I'm not sure we really disagree, I have no room for politics in a thing like that. If people don't like me, that's their problem. I mean, and my problem too. I'm not going to go and try to make a decision on public health based on what my numbers are. That doesn't matter to me. And the reason why is today I could be popular and tomorrow I'm a dog, and then the next day they build a monument to me. You cannot make these decisions on the basis of polls. I think what really works is, can you effectively open in a pattern that makes sense, where people can keep safe and be healthy, and we can get the economy moving again in the right direction. To me, that's success. And I think, Bill, at the end of the day, it comes election day. If somebody feels as though their governor really handled it well, regardless of what the ups and downs were during the polling, if people get a sense that they've done a good job, it's going to pay off for them politically. That's kind of my sense of it.
Well, thank you. So this is, I think, a useful segue into the next question, because both of your answers focused on this inherent tension in terms of pressing public health needs, as well as paying attention to the economic ramifications of COVID-19. So one thing that lots of the public have noticed is that in some states, you've seen, such as Ohio, and I bring up Ohio not only because Governor Kasich is with us, but I'm an Ohio native, so I still tend to follow politics and back home. But deliberative bodies like the House of Representatives there, or some members of the House of Representatives, have tried to limit the powers of public health officials as a way, I think, to dictate what the government response to COVID should be. Governors are both politicians in the sense that they deal with legislatures, but they also are the bosses of public health officials and are responsible for this executive side of things. So how do governors handle the tension in setting policy, and how do they persuade legislators and constituents who might believe that their response is sort of not appropriate or not commensurate with the problem?
Well, first of all, since I'm from Ohio, I'm not really too worried about the legislature in a case like this. You know, I've got to have the people around me that can give me the best advice and make the best decisions. Fortunately, for about 6 years, maybe as much as 7, there were legislative leaders that kind of understood what needed to be done in the state, and not just in regard to something like a COVID, but trying to recover in the state of Ohio economically and expanding Medicaid, things like that. The last year and a half, I think, basically they kind of got tired of me because, I'm a person, I see a problem, I want to go and fix it. You're right in a way when you say, see, I don't like this whole thing about politicians. I just don't like that. I was never in the process of measuring, I've never even looked at a poll when I was governor. I know that at one point I was way down, I finished way up. I won 86 out of 88 counties. When I ran for re-election, look, it's just my job is to I'm the father of Ohio when I was the governor, and I need to act like it. And there are always people in the legislature that are going to pick at you. They're trying to make a name for themselves, and some of them have good advice. But the legislatures that function the best with a governor, I hope Bill would agree with this, are the ones that have real leaders. I mean, they're leaders. They're not like politicians looking to take pot shots. They're people that understand the gravity of the situation, and then they go along, or they can argue with you. But at the end, you come up with agreement and you move forward. But I didn't spend a lot of my time worrying about whether I offended some legislator, because and they'll tell you that I didn't spend my time worrying about that, because that's political in nature. And I frankly wasn't that interested in politics. I was interested in good public policy, and I figured that good public policy would yield good results. And when I left, we had $3 billion in the bank in a rainy day fund. We were up about half a million jobs. We'd expanded Medicaid. We did a lot of things in the area of justice reform, sentencing reform, banning the box. A number of things that we did in terms of police and community. And we had a great 8-year success in the state of Ohio, and I think it was fundamentally because you listen, but you decide. And I'm not going to have a bunch of people pull me down because they're worried about politics or they've got a louder voice than somebody else. Yeah, that's the other thing about the public. You got to realize, well, who's screaming? Who's doing the most amount of noise? And what segment of the public do they really represent? And you always want to listen. You want to take into account what they have to say. But at the end, you got to decide. As Billy said, there's not a job that you can have that's more, that gives you more authority to do things than being governor. And I don't think you should squander it worried about whether, who's squawking at you, to be honest with you.
Well, I think, Professor, I hope this doesn't embarrass John, but we were in the House together. We came in the same year. And President Clinton, who I was close to, because he later named me to the cabinet, used to tell me, this Kasich guy, I really like the guy. The record shows that in the Clinton administration, with John as budget chairman of the House, the budget was balanced. So things worked out. So that's a tribute to John. We don't have that anymore between the president and the Congress. We don't have that anymore between the executive branch of government in Washington and the governors in the states. Now, I was fortunate when I was governor. I had a Democratic legislature in the House and Senate. It was a part-time legislature, but they were active. But I think part of your question, Professor, was the tension with the federal government. The states have, each state is different in their constitutions, but the states have the essential power to deal with issues like healthcare, jobs, response to the COVID. The executive branch role is an important bully pulpit, but they have a lot of the funding that is needed for testing, for many other activities related to the COVID. So you can't ignore the federal government. But what the problem has been, I don't want to get too political in this meeting, but, the response of the federal government to the COVID was slow and ineffective initially. And everybody was a chief and nobody wanted to make decisions. Now, it's gotten a little better, but there's still that tension. And I think the president, unfortunately, with governors, he keeps saying, well, the Democratic governors are the problem, not some of the Republican governors, although he's taken shots at them. So I don't want to overdo this, but I think this tension that exists right now is not helpful as we go down perhaps towards a second COVID crisis. Hopefully things are improving in the country, but this tension between the executive branch and the Congress, the tension between the governors and the White House is just not good. And the days when John and I were there, not that, we're the saviors, you could talk, you could get along, you could get things done. I'm not sure that's the case anymore.
Yeah, Professor, let me just add on to that. I think he's right. I mean, we did do a budget deal in '97, and Bill Richardson's a buddy of mine. I mean, I think the world of him. Some of the things that he's able to do, particularly what he's able to do with North Korea, was just amazing. I mean, we're friends. We're not going to agree on everything, but who do you agree with all the time? Bill, I think where he was going with that question was, we had, you look at Wisconsin, and in the legislature there's trying to block the governor. In my state, they didn't do really a whole lot to block me, but there are voices in there that want to, say, no, you're wrong. And even in my own party, I had to face that. But what really worked for me is I had some terrific leaders, Professor, who were in the legislature that understood the gravity of the situation. Because when I came in, we were like 20% in the hole with our budget. We had lost like 500,000 jobs. It was no time to bicker and debate. It was a time to come up with a plan, which I had been preparing for a couple of years, and then to move forward. But I think the longer you're governor, the longer you're president, what happens over time is people kind of get tired of you and they want to, assert themselves. You get to be kind of a lame duck and all that kind of stuff. I just think that's natural. We saw it happen with Obama. We saw it happen with President Bush. I mean, this is what normally happens. But you don't want to let people just pull you down, and that's where you've got to spend the time to convince them. But at the end, Bill, I tried to pass a bunch of gun control legislation. I couldn't get it done. I could not get it done. And to this day, it frosts me. And the reason I couldn't get it done is I couldn't get 1,000 people, 5,000 people, 10,000 people on the grounds of the State House. Had I had that, that would have shocked the legislature into doing something. But that was at the end. That was at the end. But think about expanding Medicaid in Ohio, in a Republican state with a Republican legislature. We got it done. So you got to listen, but at the end, you got to lead.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one more question before I get into some of the audience questions. I'm going to try to intersperse this with the audience questions, specifically picking on questions where there are repeated members of the audience asking the same question. But the last question, before we move on to that, relates to the federal response to COVID in tandem with the state responses. We've heard basically that the federal government has a role to play, but I want to ask both of you about what that role exactly is. Does the federal government complement the states? Does the federal government, or should the federal government listen to the states and provide some type of coordination with respect to helping address COVID? And has the federal government helped or hindered the individual states in terms of how they're responding to the pandemic?
All right, so I'll start with trying to be as objective as I can. Look, the problem has been that there's little right now, in my judgment, coordination to address the problem. The states' roles, I think, have been decisive in that you've had a number of states, a number of governors, bipartisan, that have acted. The federal government, the White House, I think their main role has been funding what is needed, testing, protective equipment. I have a large Native American population. And one of the problems has been in response to the COVID, the stimulus, like $600 million were going to come to the Navajo Nation, which has been the hardest hit of any community in America. And the money barely got there last week. And so there's a slow response even to issues relating to stimulus, to unemployment. The money, the amounts are fine. But somehow the response in terms of dealing with some of the economic issues, put aside the health issues, has been, should have been faster, should have been more efficient. I know that we have a Democratic House, a Republican Senate, but at the same time, I just think that I've heard some horror stories about governors getting on the phone with the president, with the executive branch on what is needed, what we need to do together. And so I just think somehow it's not a question of structural change that is needed, laws that are needed. I think a lot has to do with personal relationships. A lot has to do with how you engage. Like John Clinton liked John, so they worked on a budget. I liked President Bush. We worked on North Korea. Not that I was the entire policymaker, but somehow I sense that that's just not there right now in the federal-state relationships and in the congressional relationships with the White House. And a lot of that is personal. I know that we're moving into a technological age with Twitter, with Facebook, digital technology. So the absence of members of Congress getting together, knowing each other, Republicans and Democrats, that doesn't happen anymore. I'm a former member of the House, and my friends tell me, well, we don't talk. We come in on Tuesday, we leave Thursday. It's cable news. We hit each other. We don't deal with the issues. That the White House is doing their own thing. I'm sorry if I'm getting a little too personal and about the need for personal human dialogue, negotiations, face-to-face people in the absence of new legislation or new technology or new structural change, Professor, that I know you're an expert in.
I agree with Bill from the personal point of view, because the ultimate way for this to work was for governors to be able to call the president or the executive branch and say, hey, look, I got a problem here. Can we work on this together? I mean, the federal government, in my opinion, should be laying out guidelines as to what they would hope and what they would expect to be done, but with flexibility to the states. I think that's what makes the most amount of sense. And there needs to be a working together. Bill says you don't want to be political. He thinks the administration, didn't react soon enough. Hell, who doesn't agree with that? Of course he's right about that. I'll be stronger. They didn't get on it soon enough. At one point, the president called it a hoax. So, and that's not helpful. And, calling out governors and yelling, yelling names at them and all, that's just absurd. The way in a crisis this should work is we're all together. We're not Republicans. We're not the Democrats. We're Americans. We're here to try to work together. And if I need more ventilators out here and I tell the president, here's my problem, in the past, there was an effort to do it. I'm not saying it was always perfect in the past, but that ability to have that relationship is what really works. And as I'm so tired of all this political parties and, people talk about bipartisanship. Why don't we just realize we're all human beings trying to make it on this planet? And let's just pull together. I mean, we can agree because there's so much room to agree among people. There's more reasons to agree than disagree, but we're stuck in the disagreeing mode. And part of it starts at the top, and I'm not happy about it. So at the end, guidelines, flexibility of the states, work together, no name calling, no partisanship, and put the people first. That's kind of the way I think it should have been, or the way it should be now going forward.
Wonderful. We're going to ask one question from the audience and then return to asking some of the other questions. So we've had a number of questions that are specifically asking about the role of governors with respect to presidential elections, specifically the executive experience that you gain as a governor, and whether that helps you become president, how that motivates decisions to run for president, and whether we might be seeing some of that, maybe not from you specifically, but from current governors moving forward.
Well, I'll start out. The last time I saw John Kasich was in New Hampshire. I was going to a wedding and he was campaigning for president. We happened to be in the same restaurant, and we had a great conversation because we were friends in the Congress. And I know he ran a good race. I ran for president. I ran the wrong year against Obama. That wasn't a smart move. But my point here is that if you look historically at the last 7 presidents, many of the 7 presidents were former governors. Clinton, Bush, Reagan. But I think the year, for instance, that I ran, they wanted an inspirational candidate. They didn't care about resumes. This was 2008. That was Obama. When President Trump got elected, I think the voters wanted an outsider. So I'm not saying the interests of the American people are cyclical, but they sometimes are. In this coming election, I believe Joe Biden's qualifications as a senator, vice president, moderate, are going to do him well. I think the outsider tag that President Trump has had is not going to serve him well. But I think, Professor, obviously the American people want a candidate with qualifications. What I think is going to be very important in this COVID situation with presidential campaigns, a lot of it is going to be digital technology. You can't campaign like you used to. John's good shaking hands. So was I. I like the interaction with people. This time, because of the COVID, that personal campaigning is going to be dramatically reduced. So what I think is going to be critically important are the presidential debates, 2 or 3, I don't know how many they're going to be. And then the vice presidential debate is going to be critically important because the Democrats, we're going to have a woman candidate. And I think the American people are going to tune in. But this is going to be a different kind of presidential election because of the COVID, because of the reduction of personal campaigning because of digital technology overtaking campaigns by television and radio, that being still important, but not as important as the internet, as Facebook and Twitter. So that's what I think.
Professor Mike, let me tell you, being a congressman for 18 years, you know, sometimes when I look back on it, I think that we were all operating in a spaceship in an orbit around, you know, Uranus for that matter. Becoming a governor is a whole different deal. When you're governor, it's no longer theory about people, about poverty. It's never a theory about healthcare. It's not a theory, you know, some ideological view. When you become a governor, you got to serve the folks. As my wife said, I said this earlier, she told me, you're the governor of Ohio, why don't you act like it? And so I think experience, you know, being a mayor, being a governor is critical for being executive, for being president of the United States, because that job is not one where you got to, you know, kind of learn on the job. It's one you need to get into it. You know, as Bill was saying, you got to figure out how to have the personal relationships. You got to make decisions. You got to know who to surround yourself with. Those are the things you learn as a governor, and they have profound impact and at times profound consequences. You know, when you're a member of the Congress or a member of the United States Senate, you kind of, you know, swing around or whatever. You don't have the depth of what it takes to run the United States of America. Let me just say a couple other things. With COVID, we experienced the Black Swan event. Black Swan events, what they do is they basically reveal the weaknesses in complex organizations. I absolutely believe that the federal government is too big, too unfocused, and it's part of the problem why we've not had the response we needed to have now. I mean, I just think there's too much of it. I think too much of it is inefficient. There's too much bureaucracy. And frankly, I think it needs to be reinvented, particularly in light of the massive debt that we are now beginning to accumulate. And then the question gets to be, how much of that stuff ought to remain in Washington? You know, why does the Department of Agriculture have to be in Washington? Why do we even need a Department of Commerce? I can't figure out what they do. They have a few, 3, 4, 5 vital functions. Get rid of it. What are we going to do about Social Security? What are we going to do about Medicare? How are we going to reform the healthcare system? I mean, these are all things that we have to think about, because what this Black Swan event is revealing or showing are the fundamental weaknesses in the operation of the federal government and the fundamental weaknesses in the operation of many things in this country. And as we get back to normal, no, we're not going to be back to normal. We'll be back to a new normal. And so we have to think about the ways in which we can cover up, not cover up, but limit the weaknesses by taking the strengths of these complex systems and bringing them together so that we don't have meltdowns. And I think, you know, Bill, when you think about it, we've got, I think, 143 of the vital drugs that doctors need when they're treating people being manufactured in China and India. I mean, what the hell are we thinking about? You know, I mean, we need to think about reshoring vital parts of our economy. We need to have business. We've got to have universities thinking differently. We've got to have transportation thinking differently. This is an opportunity for massive rethinking of all the things that we have, because that's what Black Swan events do for you.
Thank you for your answers to that question. There are sort of, I heard one answer which was sort of about the Black Swan event that was very informative, and another answer about the flow of information and how the flow of information today is fundamentally different from how information flowed maybe 30 years ago. And so I'm going to begin with the information related question as it pertains to the pandemic. So one thing that you've both pointed out that makes the COVID pandemic sort of different in terms of previous pandemics, maybe it does, is that we have this decentralized media environment today. And so instead of going to official pronouncements for information, people go to Twitter, they go to Facebook, they go to Instagram for information. Individuals may not vet the information that they're receiving about events or about policies or about expertise. And this can lead to all sorts of problems in terms of communicating with the public about what the right strategies are. So how have both of you handled this environment, this decentralized media environment? And what recommendations do you have for promoting effective outreach, both in terms of COVID and more broadly?
Wow. Well, I mean, you've got a lot of issues that you raised, Professor, that are supremely important. Look, I'm a traditional politician. I love the old ways. We're not going to have probably a Democratic convention. I regret that. I regret that when you campaign, you can't do the traditional way of rallies, door to door. Politics have changed because of the COVID. Now, on technology, I'm concerned. I mentioned the importance of personal relationships, one-on-one negotiations. I've done that internationally. So has John. I preferred that, but I know the world is changing. Now, I'm very concerned. I don't want to regulate digital technology. I don't want to regulate Facebook or Twitter or Amazon. But I think there's a fundamental problem that some of these companies have taken positions on, and that is on the issue like Facebook, on knowingly dealing with false advertising and not taking a position to deal with those issues and in my view, not show them. And this was involved with some of the president's pronouncements on violence, et cetera, that I think should have been omitted. And Facebook did not want to do this. Twitter kind of took a halfway position. I don't want to regulate technology or these big companies that have brought a lot of jobs, and this is the future. This is young people, millennials, that are going to decide the election. But so I want to strike a balance, but not having been in office recently, not being in touch with the grassroots, with millennials, I don't have a good answer on what the proper balance is. But I was very angry at Facebook and Zuckerberg's position that, well, no, we're going to proceed with, we're not going to regulate false advertising of political ads. And Twitter saying, well, the president talking about violence in this Floyd case is sort of okay, but we're going to just admonish him. I think there's got to be a better balance, but I don't think I have an answer. John probably does have a good answer, but I don't.
Well, Professor, that's a complicated issue about the regulatory side of it. But for me, I use everything. I use Facebook, I use Twitter, I use Instagram, and I still use the old-fashioned thing called television. I think it's all important in terms of getting your message out. And, I just widely read because I find that we were talking, somebody sent me something this morning about Sweden and the way in which they have conducted themselves in COVID. And I received a story that said, boy, they really regret the way they did it. And I sent it to one of my friends. He sent me one back saying, oh, no, that wasn't true. We don't regret anything. I mean, it's like, it's the wild, wild west. And I think it's incumbent on everyone, number one, to widely read, use your good brain to figure out what you think is true and what you think is false. And I think get out of your silo. I mean, there's no reason to be stuck in your silo because then you're only absorbing that you agree with. So I try to use these things to communicate the things I feel strongly about. I'm doing something now with Chris Evans. He's Captain America, and he's starting a website. It's pretty cool, and I did something for him last night. I use all the mediums. I was just on a call with Sophia Bush on her Instagram, live Instagram. It's like she got 3 million followers talking about the issue of climate, and then also have an opportunity to talk about the issue of mental health, particularly for young people. So I use all of them because they're there. In terms of all the policies, it's something we have to think through very carefully. We have First Amendment, but at the same time, to me, widely read, study, and be skeptical. That to me is what really works.
Thank you. I think I have one more COVID-related question before I would like to bring up a question about George Floyd and the protests that are going on right now after that. But I'll quickly ask the COVID-related question. So a lot of this a lot of the questioning today is focused on the response to the pandemic from a public health standpoint and ignored the economic side of things. However, as I know that you both are aware of, there is a sort of perfect storm of economic problems that are occurring right now. One particular issue is sort of a skyrocketing in unemployment claims that are happening across the states. I know that there has been a discussion about states being responsible for solving their own financial problems and budgetary problems without any help from the federal government. Whether states want that help is, of course, a good question in itself, or need that help. But what should the states do, or how do the states best prepare for a situation where they have to handle all of these sort of unprecedented unemployment claims, but also stick to maintaining budgets and trying to maintain the fiscal side of things without defaulting on their debt?
John, you want to go first? I've been going first.
Look, I mean, I inherited a 20% hole with the state of Ohio, and we left with like almost a $3 billion surplus. You were asking earlier about the legislature. Yeah, they all wanted me to spend that money on any variety of things. Oh, give it to local government, give it to this group, give it to that group. I said, no, I'm not giving it to any of those groups. I'm not going to spend it. And now I think, and it's been pointed out by our governor, that he's so grateful that we're in a position of where, we have a rainy day fund, and it's going to make it easier. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but it makes it easier. And this is an opportunity for government at all levels to reinvent itself. What should it be doing? What's the role of local governments? Everybody's worried about local government. Okay, I worry about local government, but I also like local government to make the same kind of choices that I had to make as governor, or we had to make when we were trying to balance the budget. You've got to think about the way in which you want to do all these things going forward, and ways in which you can be more effective, more efficient, deliver a better product. I mean, it's going to be tough. Do we want federal aid? Of course we want federal aid. Got to make sure, though, that it doesn't become a grab bag for every single thing. There's ways in which some of this can get done without having to spend more money. I'll give you one good example. We have a lot of rural hospitals that are troubled. Bill knows them in New Mexico. So now we have these lawsuits going on, and I'm connected to this. So I got to just tell you the reason why I'm connected. I'm connected to it because I think the money from the settlements shouldn't just go to government. I think it ought to go fundamentally to hospitals, and hospitals can also recognize the fact that local governments were involved in this, also recognize that we need some infrastructure to deal with people who have addiction problems. But at the end, giving it to government, I don't think so. They can get some, but we can do some fantastic things with those resources if we apply them the right way. So, it gives you an opportunity for change, and something that I've always enjoyed being a part of.
Well, look, my first point is we're one nation. We've got to help each other. The federal government does need to help. It does need to help on unemployment, on rural hospitals, on job creation, on a stimulus. It's needed for state and local governments. Look, I started a personal fund. Well, not personal, but here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, we're a tourism economy. So a lot of retail, servers, people that lost their jobs, we started a fund that would give them a coupon of about $200 to get groceries. And it exploded in terms of interest. People are really hurting. One of the things that I think needs to happen is to reopen the economy, restaurants reopening, stores. But I tell you, we reopened in New Mexico January 1st. And I go to some restaurants, people are still not going. And I wonder if a lot of these little small shopkeepers, small businesses will survive. I think they will, but there's still, I think, a lot of lack of movement in the economy that really bothers me. Now, what do we do? Well, I think a new stimulus bill should be coming. I think it should, yes, you don't want to waste the money, but I worry mostly about minority communities that still need help with the COVID, the Native American communities, the Hispanic communities, the African American community. They need those resources for testing, for social distancing, for all kinds of treatment, tracing. that is still needed. We may have a second wave. So I do think it's critically important that federal government to step in. In my state, you know, we're not as fortunate to have as big a diversified economy as Ohio is. We're a tourism economy, federal government. We're trying to develop a high-tech economy. We've developed movies. I brought movies into the state. I think it's important with our border with Mexico. There's some communities that are really hurting. So that federal assistance to a small state like mine that still is relatively poor, that needs that assistance, needs to happen. So we don't want to have our hand out. We have to responsibly spend this money. But to say that, you know, you're on your own, state, you know, we don't want to bail you out. I've heard that rhetoric, including from some governors. I think the governor of Florida. That's not America. I think we need to help each other here.
No, in this time, Professor, and you know, I'm one of the fathers of the balanced budget. Bill's right. I mean, there's things we have to do. My concern is as they go for the next package, that you just don't load it all up with things we might not need. There are things like forbearance that we have to talk about with landlords and with lending institutions. And there's so many people that are hurting through this with unemployment. What we don't want to do, however, is to give them the kinds of things where they have more incentive not to work than to work. But that's a whole nother issue. But Bill's right about it. I mean, this is a time when you've got to do it. And then at the federal government, you have to start thinking about how you're going to deal with this massive debt, because you don't want inflation and you don't want to have these kind of economic problems. But right now, the patient is very sick and the patient needs medicine. We just got to make sure it's the right kind and we don't go overboard. And it's a partnership with the states. A lot of people really, really hurting. It's flesh and blood. The Fed's doing a pretty good job too, Bill, right now. They're involved in trying to make sure that we don't have a collapse of the credit markets. I think these things are all positive here.
Thank you for that response. So I'm going to ask one more question before I think Claire is going to bring up some questions from the audience. And my final question pertains to George Floyd and the protests. So obviously, this country is hurting right now. And there are longstanding issues of how to make the country more fair, how to make the country more just, and specifically how to make sure that what happened to Mr. Floyd doesn't happen again. Because frankly, I think a lot of people, a lot of good people are sick and tired of these things happening again and again and again. And so governors are in this position where they can effect positive change. And you both have a long and distinguished careers in public service. So what advice would you give? What initiatives did you take to work towards a fairer, more just society?
Well, I'll start. First, you don't gas people like we recently did in Washington. You don't have a president marching towards a church with a Bible for a photo op. You don't proceed with deploying our military, our distinguished military, on domestic protesters, lawful protesters. Yes, there's no question that we've had situations where there's been looting. I mean, nobody's going to justify that. But I think what you also do is you have to look at stronger police training, find those bad apples that exist. But we still have to protect and honor our law enforcement people. But there's got to be a way that law enforcement works closer with communities, particularly communities of color, particularly African-American neighborhoods. I can tell you why African Americans are so upset at these endless killings that have happened, and no response, somehow no sympathy. So you start with closer efforts to bring communities closer to law enforcement. Community policing, I think, is good. I think find ways to integrate our police communities with more minorities. I think there's a funding issue too. I don't see why we sell military equipment to local governments. Local governments can buy it on their own. Why do we need excess military equipment that goes to our local communities? So those are steps that I think need to be taken. But I don't have all the answers, but I am so upset at what's happening with the racial tensions that are existing today in America, not just in Washington and our major cities, but in rural areas too.
Professor, we had a lot of trouble out here in Ohio. We had a case where African Americans were chasing the car. The police shot about 140 rounds into the car at these folks, killed them. They were unarmed. You might remember Tamir Rice, the young boy, had the plastic gun. The police pulled up and shot and killed him. Nina Turner, who was a Democrat, African American, terrific legislator, along with a few others, came to see me and said, we need to have a study. I said, well, tomorrow we're just going to start moving. We're not going to study. We're going to get moving. So we opened a program that brought law enforcement, community activists, professors who had studied the civil rights issues. We just had ministers, a great group. They went around the state, they listened, and then they came up with a series of recommendations. And one of them was about the use of force and the use of deadly force. And you would be amazed at how many police agencies don't have a policy on that. Many of them in Ohio did not have a policy on that. Not only do you need to have a policy, but your law enforcement have to understand the policy, and they need to be trained towards that policy. We got into the area of recruitment. Bill mentioned it, the idea of recruiting more people that reflect the community. Also, the ability to integrate police into the community so the community understands police understand the community. And maybe one of the most significant things, which was the collection of data, so that we could find out who the police were arresting, what it looked like. And this was one that people were amazed could actually be put into effect, along with the use of body cameras, things like that. We have about 80% of all the police agencies in Ohio who have adopted this. Now, as we were working through this and communicating, so it wasn't just listening, we actually had these things that we were putting in place and asking police departments to be able to accept them. We had a Republican convention for 4 days in Cleveland. And because we'd been working together and listening, not one single window was broken in Cleveland, Ohio during that convention. The proof was in the pudding. When you listen and you act and you get people to move in the same direction, understanding what's at stake, it's amazing what can be accomplished. And Nina Turner and I, what we really want to do is we want to take this to the country, to cities, to local police departments, because we believe these things have a significant impact in terms of the relations that exist between police and community.
Thank you. And I think Claire is going to highlight some questions that audience members have asked.
Thank you so much, Professor. As you may know, Colorado has mail-in balloting and has for the last several election cycles. And in fact, Colorado has one of the highest voter turnouts in the country. Well, because of COVID, more states are considering going to mail-in balloting more broadly and not just for absentee balloting. So Katie asks, how do we safely use technology and mail-in ballots to provide more access to voting without increasing fraud? And how can governors assist in tackling this issue?
Well, maybe I'll start. When I was governor of New Mexico, we had a lot of problems with computer balloting. So we went back to paper balloting. And I think that was the right decision. I am for more voter participation. As a nation, we only vote in presidential elections, 50% of those eligible voters. That is so much less than most industrialized countries, even third world countries. We should aim higher. So I am for mail-in ballots. I am for absentee ballots, online voting, same-day registration. Just encourage our people to vote. Yeah, you got to make sure that they're not fraudulent. But I think Colorado, you've done it right. I'm all for what you've done. You've been progressive in a lot of areas that I think need to happen. And so I commend you. So I hope this experiment is working well with you. I hope my state, we're moving forward on some of these initiatives. But we had, for instance, a Democratic primary 2 days ago, and the voter turnout was strong, was good. We had absentee voting. We had a number of ways that our voters can go to the polls. This is good, and we commend Colorado, not on everything, but you're north of us, and we like you enormously, and we work very closely together.
But Claire, I favor mail-in ballots, and it's up to the Secretary of State in each state to figure out how they can do it. And it's existed in 3 or 4 states. It's been fine. I favor it.
So going back to the tragic death of George Floyd, Nancy asked or comments initially that the issue with George Floyd exposed that there's deep-seated racism in American society and that this persists. So she asks, who's going to lead us to a solution, the federal government or the governors?
Look, it's got to be the President of the United States. Yes, governors can lead and should lead, and many governors are leading. And, John Kasich did that. I believe I did that. But, a president is somebody that unifies the country, that can heal the country, that is the soul of the country. Because of the huge bully pulpit, because of the resources that the Justice Department has on civil rights issues, because of the ability of a president through legislation, through what the president proposes to the Congress on issues relating not just to civil rights, but to community policing, towards jobs and healthcare. I think it's the president that is the unifier, the decider on this issue more than the governors. Although, I always take the governor's side, but in this case, it's an American president who would be the leader.
Claire, I think it's both in and out. I think, of course, you need to have a national leader who can help pull us together, get people to overcome their feelings towards one another, remembering we're all made in the image of the Lord. But I also have to tell you that I think most change in America comes from the bottom up, including civil rights. Civil rights didn't come about because the people in Washington were particularly interested. Martin Luther King and the efforts that he made that grew, nonviolent efforts, that he never resorted to violence, that it was from the streets, it was from the pulpits, it was from the universities where there was a great push for civil rights. The same is true on rights for women. I don't think, Claire, you should ever be confused. Those guys wanted to give you all the power that you demanded. It came from the bottom up. And so each of us has to do what we can do to make sure that we love our neighbor, treat our neighbor as we want our neighbor to treat us. And so I think there's more and more Americans beginning to understand. For example, I was with a friend of mine today who was on a business call, and an African American was asked to say a few words, and he or she said, whenever my son, I don't remember, he gave me a couple stories, but whenever my son leaves home, I tell him to text me because I'm always so worried he's going to get into a place and something's going to happen to him that's bad by law enforcement. And my friends, his eyes were opened. I said, well, this is not unusual. These are the things that African Americans have to deal with. And my friend that I was talking to today is not African American. And he's like, wow. And I said, yeah, that's the way it is. So it starts with us.
So we're almost out of time, but I have one last question for you both. 2020 has been a real humdinger of a year, and it's June 4th. So we have no idea what's ahead of us. But I've seen some comments that perhaps we're looking at this incorrectly, that perhaps 2020 is the year we've all been waiting for, the year that wakes people up, the year that brings about change. And Governor Kasich, I'd like to start with you because you literally just wrote a book on things that can affect change. So what is something you think we could all do to affect change?
Well, look, everybody wants to live a life a little bigger than themselves, and we have to have the confidence to know that that's what our purpose is, that we're all part of a mosaic, and hopefully a healing mosaic, and we have to find our purpose, and we don't compare one good thing to another. Anything you do, nothing good is ever lost. I think we have to think about, and I will tell you though, on 2020, my wife has a little sign she had, and she wrote on it, "Yay 2020," and she's just put a big X across it. Okay, it is a tumultuous year. There's been a lot of pain. There's going to continue to be pain, but we of course are going to get through this. And how do we get through it? We get through it through the spirit of everybody that's listening to this and people across our country. Do something good for somebody else. And we've seen it during COVID. People checking in with our seniors, people delivering food, the heroes who are healthcare workers. They're all inspiring. And I think we have to stop waiting for somebody to come in on a white charger to save the day. Saving the day starts with us. And if we push it, it becomes contagious. So am I pessimistic about the future? I am not. I'm optimistic about the future. But the future is going to be determined by, and this is not political, I'm not running for anything, by you and me. And the way we treat people in our communities and our families and our neighborhood, and stop the hate. Stop the hate and stop all the garbage politics we see. And let's remember, we're Americans first, and we have a duty and obligation to our children and our children's children. Thanks for letting me be part of this tonight. They say there's mountains in Vail. I'm gonna have to check that out.
Well, I'll conclude. Can I still answer, Claire, or do you have to
Yes,
sign
yes,
off?
sir, please.
Okay, well, look, 2020 has not been a good year. I know I will try to bring something good out of this, and I am optimistic about the country. But with the racial incidents, the COVID, the economy, people losing so many jobs, people dying over 110,000. This has not been a good year. It's not been a good start. What is the positive that I possibly see? And I saw it like on Tuesday in my own state. I saw more persons of color, more women getting elected. Our democracy becoming more representative. My hope, and this is a hope in the presidential election, that we come up with a woman vice president. I think that's good. I think there's been underrepresentation of many people of color. And if there's a need to do something, it's on the COVID issue in our African American, our Hispanic, our Native American communities. They need more help. They need more representation. They need more political power. So my hope is that there will be a huge influx of people of color in this coming election, in power, in county commissions, and not just in the Congress and the presidency. I know you want me to end up, but I will do that. So that's my hope now. But I'm optimistic about this country. But Claire, this has not been a good year. It can only get better.
It can only get better. Claire, I want to tell you something. The reason why I agreed to do this thing tonight is because Bill Richardson asked if I would be willing to do it. And I did it out of great respect and friendship with him. And, we may be in different political parties, but we're human beings. And I tell you something, when Bill didn't tell you that when we ran into each other in New Hampshire, we'd had a crisis in North Korea. And Bill has had a remarkable ability to, because he's talked about it repeatedly tonight, he had a remarkable ability to be able to relate to people in a really good, positive way, to listen to them. He's so likable and all that. And it's great for me to be able to do this tonight, but I have to tell you, with all the things that come in and all the requests, it was Bill Richardson and his request that got me to do this. And we're buddies, and we should be optimistic about people like the two of us who worked together before and will work together again.
Well, Governor Kasich, I can tell you, nobody was more surprised than I was when both of you agreed to do this with us this evening, but I am so glad you did. You're both such extraordinarily accomplished individuals, and I'm so glad that you brought those talents to bear on public service. And I know neither of you had to do this evening, but I am so glad you did. I do want to mention one other thing because I think he's too modest to mention it. But Michael White is coming home today. And Michael White was being held by the Iranians for the last 2 years. And Bill Richardson was instrumental in his release. And so I want to thank both of you for your continued public service. And we really were honored by your presence tonight. Professor Parinandi, you did an awesome job. Those were great questions. And we also thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
John. Thank you all.
Good
Thank
night,
you,
everyone.
Chinu. Thank you, Claire. Thanks
Thank
to
you, sir.
Vail.
Good night.
And Michael White is home. You're right. Thank you.
Thank you.